You're standing on a beach 20 million years ago. The water looks calm. Then a shadow passes beneath the surface and it just keeps passing and passing. By the time it's gone, you've counted off enough seconds that a school bus could have driven past you, nose to tail, underwater. That wasn't one animal being unusually large. That was Tuesday for an ocean that used to be full of things built to end you instantly and without warning. Today, we're looking at 7 of the most genuinely terrifying animals that ever actually lived on this planet. Not movie monsters, not exaggerations, real animals, backed by real fossils, that make almost everything alive today look mild by comparison. And by the end of this, you're going to understand something uncomfortable. The scariest thing about these animals isn't how big they were. It's how recently, in the grand scheme of things, some of them were still around. Let's start with the one everyone already half knows about, because it's earned every bit of its reputation. Meet Megalodon, the largest predatory shark to ever exist, and for a long time, we had it completely wrong. For decades, the standard image of Megalodon was simple. Take a great white shark and scale it up. Same thick, stocky, torpedo-shaped body, just 3 or 4 times bigger. That's the version in the documentaries, the version in the movies, the version everyone pictures. Here's the myth-busting part. In 2024 and 2025, teams of paleontologists went back to actual fossil vertebrae. The closest thing we have to a real skeleton, since shark skeletons are made of cartilage, and almost never survive fossilization intact. What they found didn't match the great white body plan at all. Megalodon's spine suggests a longer, leaner, more elongated body, closer in proportion to a lemon shark or a mako than to a great white. And here's why that actually matters. Beyond just getting the shape right, a stocky, bulky body becomes incredibly expensive to power once you get much past 20 feet long. It takes enormous amounts of energy just to push that shape through water. A longer, sleeker shape solves that problem, letting an animal grow far bigger before the physics start working against it, which leads to the second part of this update, the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Using this new slimmer body shape, researchers calculated a theoretical maximum length of around 24 meters. That's roughly 80 feet. For comparison, most previous estimates topped out around 50 to 60 feet. To be fair to the science here, that 80-foot figure is described as an upper biological limit, not a typical size, and plenty of individuals were likely smaller, with more conservative modern estimates still landing somewhere between 15 and 20 meters for a large adult. But even the conservative end of that range is still comfortably longer than a school bus, with a bite force that modeling suggests could exceed anything alive on Earth today, including modern whales. It hunted whales. It hunted whales that were already enormous by modern standards, and it did that as a routine meal, not a special occasion. Megalodon disappeared somewhere around 3.5 million years ago, likely due to cooling oceans and increased competition, including possibly early competition from the ancestors of modern great white sharks. It's not ancient in the way you might assume either. 3.5 million years sounds huge, until you remember that early human ancestors were already walking around by then. We didn't miss Megalodon by an unimaginable stretch of time. We missed it by what is, geologically speaking, basically nothing. Let's move to land. Sort of. Because our next animal lived in swamps so hot and humid that its very existence tells us something about the climate at the time. Meet Titanoboa. And I want you to actually sit with this number for a second. Over 42 feet long and weighing more than a small car. This wasn't a big snake. This was a snake the length of a city bus, thick enough around the middle that an adult human couldn't get their arms around it. Titanoboa lived in what's now Colombia, roughly 58 to 60 million years ago, which puts it after the extinction of the dinosaurs, not during their time. This snake showed up in the aftermath, in a jungle that had recovered from that apocalypse and gone completely wild. Here's the discovery story, and it's a good one. Researchers working in a coal mine in Colombia kept finding large fossilized vertebrae. And for a while, they assumed these belonged to an ancient crocodile, since crocodile fossils were common in that region and giant vertebrae seemed like an obvious match. It wasn't until scientists took a closer look at the shape of the bones that they realized something was very wrong with that assumption. Crocodile vertebrae have a very specific structure. These didn't match it. What they matched, once properly compared, was a snake, just an impossibly, almost unbelievably large one. When the full research was published in 2009, it didn't just introduce a new species, it rewrote what scientists thought was physically possible for a snake to become. Here's the part that should genuinely fascinate you, not just scare you. Snakes are cold-blooded, meaning their body temperature depends entirely on their environment, and there's a real measurable relationship between how hot a climate is and how large cold-blooded animals can grow within it. Titanoboa's sheer size is being used today as an actual data point, a biological thermometer, to help estimate just how hot the tropics were 60 million years ago. This snake wasn't just a predator, it's now also a scientific instrument, reconstructed from stone, telling us about the climate of a world that no longer exists. Now let's talk about something that hunted dinosaurs. Because yes, that's a real sentence, and yes, it's real biology. Meet Deinosuchus. And before we go any further, let's clear up a common misconception. Most people assume this was simply a giant crocodile. It wasn't, not exactly. Deinosuchus is more closely related to modern alligators than to true crocodiles, making it a genuine giant cousin of the alligator sitting in a swamp somewhere in the southern United States right now, just scaled up to a horrifying degree. We're talking about an animal estimated to have reached somewhere between 33 and 39 feet long, roughly double the length of the largest crocodilians alive today. It lived across North America during the late Cretaceous period, somewhere between 75 and 82 million years ago, meaning it was alive at the same time as many dinosaurs you'd recognize immediately. And here's the evidence that tells us exactly how it made a living. Paleontologists have found dinosaur bones bearing deep, unmistakable bite marks, wounds that match the size, shape, and spacing of Deinosuchus' teeth perfectly. This wasn't a scavenger picking at carcasses. The bite patterns show puncture and drag marks consistent with an active ambush predator, something that could lie almost completely submerged in a river, invisible until the moment it wasn't, and take down animals that on land had no real natural predators at all. Imagine being an enormous dinosaur, something that could comfortably fend off almost any land-based threat, and still needing to think twice before stepping into a river. That's the position Deinosuchus put entire ecosystems in for millions of years. Let's go back even further, past the dinosaurs entirely, to a period so different from ours that the air itself worked differently. Meet Arthropods, and I want you to picture as clearly as you can a millipede the length of a small car. In 2021, researchers in Northumberland, England, uncovered a fossil confirming this animal reached lengths of around 2.63 meters. That's roughly 8.5 feet, making it the largest arthropod, meaning the largest creature with a hard exoskeleton and jointed legs ever known to have existed on land. It lived during the Carboniferous period, somewhere between 326 and 345 million years ago, long before dinosaurs, long before most of what you'd recognize as complex land life had even shown up yet. Here's the part that raises a genuinely interesting question. How does something with an exoskeleton, a rigid outer shell, instead of an internal skeleton, get that large in the first place? Modern insects and arthropods are limited in size, partly because of how they breathe, through tiny tubes that bring oxygen directly into their tissues rather than using lungs. That system works fine at small scale, but becomes seriously inefficient as an animal gets bigger. The leading explanation for Arthropods' size involves the atmosphere itself. Oxygen levels during the Carboniferous period are believed to have been significantly higher than they are today, possibly over 30% of the atmosphere compared to roughly 21% now. That extra oxygen may have allowed arthropod breathing systems to support much larger bodies than would ever be possible in our current air. One more thing worth mentioning, because it might genuinely surprise you. Despite the terrifying scale, current evidence suggests Arthropods was most likely a herbivore or a detritivore, meaning it primarily ate plants and decaying organic material, not other animals. An 8-foot-long armored millipede, and it was probably just quietly eating rotting leaves the entire time. And speaking of that same high-oxygen world, it wasn't just millipedes that got a size upgrade. The sky did too. Meet Megalodon, a dragonfly relative with a wingspan reaching up to around 70 to 75 centimeters, close to 28 inches across. Picture the largest bird you'd typically see at a park, and now picture an insect roughly matching that wingspan, buzzing silently between the trees during the exact same Carboniferous period as our giant millipede. Megalodon is often used as the textbook example of the same oxygen-driven gigantism theory. Insects breathe through a network of tiny tubes that diffuse oxygen directly to their tissues, a system that becomes a serious bottleneck as body size increases in a normal oxygen environment. In an atmosphere carrying significantly more oxygen than today's, that constraint loosens considerably, potentially allowing insects to grow to sizes that would be completely biologically impossible in our current air. There's something almost peaceful and eerie about picturing it. A world with air so rich that a dragonfly could grow to the size of a hawk, silently patrolling ancient swamps that no longer exist, breathing an atmosphere that would feel strange and heavy in our own lungs today. Now for one of the strangest mystery stories on this entire list, because this next animal is known from essentially one piece of evidence, and scientists are still debating exactly what that evidence tells us. Meet Andrewsarchus, generally considered the largest known land-based carnivorous mammal to have ever existed. And I want to be upfront about something immediately. Almost everything we know about this animal comes from a single skull. That skull discovered in Mongolia in 1923. During an expedition led by naturalist Roy Chapman Andrews, measures about 83 centimeters long, close to 33 inches, making it noticeably larger than the skull of any big cat, bear, or other land predator alive today. No other confirmed body fossils have ever been found. Every full-body reconstruction you've ever seen of this animal, every illustration, every documentary rendering, is an educated extrapolation built from that one skull, compared against related hoofed mammal groups from the same time period. Andrewsarchus lived roughly 45 million years ago, during the Eocene epoch, in what's now Mongolia and China. Here's the responsible caveat worth including. Because for a long time, popular depictions treated this animal as a straightforward apex predator, a mammalian equivalent to a T-Rex. More recent scientific interpretation leans towards something a bit different. Current thinking suggests Andrewsarchus was likely an opportunistic omnivore, possibly scavenging as much as actively hunting based on tooth wear patterns and comparisons to related species. Either way, an animal with a skull that size, built by unknown proportions we're still debating almost exactly a century after its discovery, remains one of the most genuinely mysterious predators or scavengers in the entire fossil record. For our final creature, let's revisit one of the strangest identity mysteries in paleontology. Because for nearly 100 years, scientists could not agree on what this animal's most famous feature actually looked like, or where on its body it was even located. Meet Helicoprion, a shark relative best known for an extraordinary tightly coiled spiral made almost entirely of teeth. First described in 1899, based only on an isolated fossil fragment of that spiral. This fossil sparked decades of wild reconstruction attempts. Some scientists placed the tooth whorl on the tip of the upper jaw, curling upward like a trunk. Others placed it hanging from the lower lip. One especially memorable theory placed it curling backward down the throat like some kind of internal saw. For over 100 years, nobody actually knew, because the spiral kept being found completely disconnected from the rest of the skull. Here's where the actual evidence finally settled things. In 2013, researchers led by paleontologist Leif Tapanila used detailed CT scanning technology on a fossil specimen from Idaho, creating a full three-dimensional model without having to physically damage the fossil at all. What they found ended a century of guessing, definitively. The tooth whorl wasn't external at all. It was located entirely inside the lower jaw, positioned along the midline, curling inward on itself like a continuously growing conveyor belt of teeth, functioning less like an external buzzsaw slicing through prey, and more like a rotating internal blade, likely used to grip and slice soft-bodied prey such as ancient squid relatives as they were pulled inward toward the throat. A full century of confident, published, textbook illustrations, and it turns out almost none of them had the basic anatomy. Right. The truth had been sitting fossilized in solid rock this entire time, waiting for a scanner precise enough to finally see through the stone. So here's what all 7 of these animals actually have in common. Once you step back and look at the full list together, a shark that we recently discovered was both leaner and possibly far larger than we assumed. A snake so massive it's now used as a climate measuring tool. A relative of the modern alligator that hunted dinosaurs and left the bite marks to prove it. A millipede the length of a car and a dragonfly the size of a hawk, both made possible by air that doesn't exist on Earth anymore. A predator or scavenger known from a single skull that's been debated for a century, and a shark whose most famous feature was completely misunderstood for generations, hiding in plain sight until a scanner finally proved everyone wrong. None of these animals needed exaggeration. The real numbers, the real fossils, the real research are already more unsettling than fiction. And here's the part worth sitting with as we close this out. Several of these animals weren't separated from us by some unimaginable, incomprehensible gulf of time. Megalodon was still swimming in Earth's oceans, while early human ancestors were already walking around on land. We didn't dodge these animals by living in some completely different chapter of the planet's story. In several cases, we simply showed up right after the story had already ended for them, missing them by a margin that, on a planetary scale, barely counts as a margin at all.